Rambam Hilchos Tshuva. The Rebbeinu Shalom runs the world, and we've been learning that and learning that and learning that, and nothing is a coincidence. And it's the first day of Slichus, and we're on page Ayin in the Ramchal Daas Tevunos. For those who are using the paragraph system, we're in paragraph Pei, paragraph 80, and we're right exactly where we should be on the first day of Slichus. First day of Slichus, we said Slichus last night. We already began repeating the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim. Hashem, Hashem, Kel Racham, B'chanun, Erech Hapayim, Vav Chesed, Ve'emes. And we're beginning the process of Slichus, and we're going to say every day the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim. And then we continue Aseres Yemei Tshuva, and then of course Yom Kippur, we repeat the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim over and over, and by Ne'ilah we say it over and over and over. What are the Gimel Midas Harachamim? We talked about this several times in different shiurim. These are not characteristic traits of the Rebbeinu Shalom. They're not even names of the Rebbeinu Shalom. The Rebbeinu Shalom doesn't have a name. You can, and we'll see this in the Ramchal today, you can only give something a name when you understand, you want to describe something. We have words. We say this is a car. And what does the word car mean? Okay, a car means it's something that has 4 tires and an engine, and it takes gasoline, and it goes from place to place, whatever the definition is. A person can say a motorcycle. A motorcycle is 2 wheels. Sometimes it has 4 wheels. Sometimes it has a side compartment. Descriptive words mean something. You cannot describe the Rebbeinu Shalom. It's not possible. So when we say Hakel Rachum, God's compassionate, you cannot think. You can think, but it's just a terrible mistake. You cannot think that God has a characteristic trait of Rachamim. He has a trait, like a human being has compassion. God has compassion. God doesn't have compassion. I can't talk about God. I don't know what he is at all. I can't describe him. I can't say car. I can't say motorcycle. I can't say washing machine. I can't say any word about him because I am then being magdal him. I'm then limiting him to my description, and he's an Ein Sof. You cannot describe him in any way. So what is Rachum, Chanun, Erech Hapayim? What do all these things mean? So that's what the Ramchal is going to talk about today, and we talked about this, as I said before. These are not descriptions of God. So let's take now a look at the Ramchal on page Ayin. The Omnam, middle of the page, the Omnam Dava Zeh Bi'aruhu Yofa B'Medrasha Sh'Rab Shimba Yechoy, Raya Mehemna. Rab Shimba Yechoy in the Zohar HaKadosh, in part of the Zohar that's called Raya Mehemna. In Parshas Pinchas, the Zohar HaKadosh says as follows. Now, before we go into the Zohar HaKadosh, what does this have to do with our discussion until now about the Guf and the Neshama? Well, the Ramchal is now going to give you a better view of what we're talking about. We said that the Guf is created from a Hastoras Funim. It's dense and dark, and it has component parts. Eyes, ears, the eyes can't hear, and the ears can't see, etc. The Neshama is made up of Ha'oras Funim, and therefore it's not component parts. It's one perfect, to the extent that we can talk about this, it's one perfect unity. It's a Chelek Elikinima. The same way that God, on a different level completely, is one perfect unity. Echad, Yochid, Umiyuchad. God sees. How does he see? He sees. God sees. Where? From what? From an eye? From nothing. Everything that's God, which is everything, sees. And everything that is God, which is everything, hears. There's no component parts there. On a lower level, on a chelek elikimi mal level, the neshama is not made up of component parts, and it does everything. The neshama, before it comes into the guf, is roya misayfa oilam vad sayfa. We learned this. The neshama can see from one end of the universe to the other. You push the neshama, the Baruch Shalom pushes the neshama into the guf, and all of a sudden the neshama is in this dense, dark thing, and it can't see except through human eyeballs. But what allows the human eyeballs to see? The neshama. All of a sudden, the neshama can't hear except through the physical ears, and that's limited. So the neshama into the guf, which results in a living human being, is a tzimtzum. The same way that the Rebbeinu Shalom created the whole world by a tzimtzum, which we've talked about, he created man through a tzimtzum. Neshama into the guf, and suddenly the neshama's powers are restricted to the physical limitations of the body. So now that we talked about that at length, and the Ramchal explained that, now he's going to explain to us something about the Ribono Shel Olam, because this is, the guf comes from the Hastoras Panim, the neshama comes from the Ha'oras Panim. The guf is component parts and therefore breaks down. The neshama is a shleimus. It's a sort of perfection because it's Ha'oras Panim from God. Now we're going to learn something about the Ribono Shel Olam, and through learning something about the Ribono Shel Olam, we're going to get a better understanding of this idea of shleimus of the neshama, because it's a chelek elikim mimal. On a level of a chelek elikim mimal, the Ribono Shel Olam is a sholem. On a different level, the neshama is a sholem. What exactly is sholem by HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So we say there's no component parts, but because there's no component parts, there's no name for it. A human being, you can look at the human being and say his ears, his eyes, his nose, his teeth, his head, his hair, his hands, his toes, his fingers. You can talk about and you can say he has long fingers, he has short fingers, he has blue eyes, he has brown eyes, he has big ears, he has small ears. His hair is getting white, his hair is black, he has a thick neck, he has a thin neck. Because of all these different component parts, they are subject to description. When we're not talking about component parts, there's nothing to describe. You can't describe anything. What are you going to describe? You're going to describe the eyes, there are no eyes. You can describe the sight, you can't describe sight. Sight of what? You can see from one end of the universe to the other. What does one end of the universe to the other end of the universe mean? It doesn't really mean anything. There's nothing left to describe once you understand that there's no component parts here. And if that's going to be true for the Ribono Shel Olam, on a lower level, that's going to be true for the neshama. You cannot describe a neshama. It is what it is. It goes into the body, and the eyes work, the ears work, the nervous system works, the heart works, the lungs work. And what is the neshama? It's a neshama. It does everything. In one compact unit, it does everything, and you can't describe it fully. It's not ears, it's not eyes, it's not sight, it's not hearing, it's not chewing, it's not smell. It is. It's neshama. So this is why the Ramchal is now going to bring down a Zohar HaKadosh. This is explained in the Medrash of Reb Shimon Yochai. This is how the Zohar HaKadosh used to be referred to. We have a Medrash Rabbah, we have a Medrash Tanchuma, there are other types of Medrashim, and the Zohar used to be called also Medrash. It's the Medrash of Reb Shimon Yochai. Zelushaina. This is what the Medrash, the Reb Shimon Yochai says in Raya Mehemna Pashas Pinchas. The Islaminda, you need to know, the Iyu Iskri Chacham B'chol Minei Chachmas, that God is called Chacham because of all forms of knowledge. God is called a Chacham because of all the forms of knowledge. What does that mean? Besides the Kabbalists who explain the Zohar and they explain this statement as well, which Ramchal says I'm not going into. I have to go into the Kabbalist. Let's get a basic understanding of what the Zohar is telling us. The simple words of the Zohar are going to teach you what I have explained to you above. God has a lot of quote-unquote nicknames. We call God different things. We call him a Rachum. We call him a Chanun. He's a compassionate God. He's a forgiving God. We give him all kinds of nicknames. Loilafi atzmoi. It has nothing to do with God's actual essence. It has nothing to do with his existence. You are not describing God. Loilafi atzmoi. Elulafi briyosa. Anything that we use to describe God is based upon how we understand God running the world or God treating us. When something happens to us and we feel God's compassion, we say God's compassionate. Not because he has a characteristic trait, chas v'sholom, of compassion. It's because he has treated us with compassion, and therefore we, as human beings, we say, I feel the compassion. Instead of saying, I feel the compassion, we say, God's compassionate. I don't know if this is a good mashal. Somebody throws $100 bill towards you. He wants to give you a gift. He throws the $100 towards you and you get the $100. The person that threw the $100 is not $100. He owned $100 and he threw $100 to you and you got the $100. You are the beneficiary of his $100. But the person, you're not going to call the person the $100 man. Now, people do that. They say sometimes a guy walks around the street and he's giving out $100 bills to everybody. We nickname him the $100 man. Why is he nicknamed the $100 man? Because he's throwing out $100 bills to everybody. That's a nickname. But he's not it could be a nickname, but that's all it is. It's a nickname. He's not a $100 man. His name is Bobby or his name is Reuben, whatever his name is. And he is who he is. And because he did something, you gave him a nickname. So you can either say, I got $100 from Reuven, or you can say, I got $100 from the $100 man. But when you're speaking about the Ribbono Shalom, and the Ribbono Shalom sends Rachamim to someone, the person is the beneficiary of Rachamim from God, who is able to send Rachamim. It doesn't mean that God has Rachamim. It doesn't mean that that's any intrinsic characteristic trait. We are the beneficiary of Rachamim. It's about us. It is not something that defines him. In fact, as we've spoken about many times, all these things are tools. God created these things. He created Rachamim, and he sends out Rachamim. He created Chanun, and he sends out Chanun. Svasemes, in Chodesh Elul, one of the pieces in the Svasemes, he talks about the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim. So the word Midos, what does the word Midah mean? So when we talk about human beings, we say he has good Midas, he has bad Midas. When we use the word Midas, the Midas has become to mean a person's character. He has bad character, he has good character, he has good Midas, he has bad Midas. We've come to use the word Midah as a character trait. So then when we say Yud Gimel Midas HaRachman, God has 13 Midas HaRachman. We say 13 characteristic traits of compassion. God doesn't have a character. He doesn't have characteristic traits. As Vasemis explains the real word Midah, we know what the word Midah means. Midah is limidod. Bamidah, bamiskol, bamishkol, bamisura. It's a word in the Torah. Midah means to measure. It's It's a measurement. Mida, the Sfas Emes says, is HaKadosh Baruch Hu has all kinds of these tools to run the world, and he measures how much of each tool should be used at a given time. This at this moment in time, this is how much rachamim I'm sending. At this moment of time, this is how much chanan. This is how much. This is how much. This is how much din. This is how much this. This is how much this. These are all measured, and that's why they're called midas. They are not characteristic traits. So even though we give HaKadosh Baruch Hu nicknames, we are the beneficiaries of God's Rahmanas. Instead of saying we are beneficiary of God's Rahmanas, we use some kind of nickname, shorthand, and we say God's compassion, which means that I'm the recipient of God's compassion. And this is what Rav Shimon Bar Yochai continues and says in the Zohar, Al Shem Beryan Dav Asiden Liboros. All these names, Rachum, Chanan, all these quote-unquote tools, which we think are characteristic traits, but they're not, they were only created for the world that was going to be created. These are tools that are going to be used. These are created tools to be used for a world that's going to be created. V'amnam amru al shem beryan hu pashut. Ki lo ne'em ashudav nishchadish boy chas v'sholom. Ki ein chidush v'shini boy. El game ha'metchila hoye v'koyche la'aseh zeh. God could have always, the question, why did God create the world when he created the world? You can't ask that question, because why did God create the world when he created the world means you're asking a question about time. And before he creates the world, there's no time. So you can't say God could have created the world before. Before what? There's no clock running to say the word before. Everything could have been created, quote unquote, at any time. God selected we have no words, the moment to create the world. And with that, he used these, quote unquote, midos in order to be able to create the world. But none of these things are changes in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You want to call it potential, you can call it potential, something the Ramchal talks about. All these things are there. There is nothing that is new about God. In other words, God decided to create the world, and at that time he decided that he's going to become compassionate. What does that mean? Before he created the world, there was no compassion. He didn't have compassion. The compassion didn't. What does it mean? None of this is new about God. There's never any change or something new happened to God. He's God. Whatever the word, we have no words for this. Even from the very beginning, God could have done all of this. What does that mean? What do you mean from the very beginning? There's no time. How can you use the word beginning? But that's the problem. We have no words to describe God. We have no words to describe his existence. If we take a look at footnote 169, Rav Friedlander, Kivan shetomid hoye bicholta yisporach liberes habrila v'staken hanaga. It was always within God's ability to create the world and create all the rules by which he would supervise the world. Before he created the world, again, before is a difficult word, but we have no words to describe what was going on before. And we're really not even talk about what's going on before. Mishnah Chagig Yud Aleph Amud Beis. But for purposes of our understanding, the fact that we can talk this way proves that we don't understand what in the world we're talking about. God had the potential ability, even before he created the world, to create the world. And even before he created the Rachum and the Chanan, he had the potential to create it. It was all there and there's nothing new. Well, how can you talk about before if there's no time? You're right. This proves that what I just said is something that we can only talk about as human beings, but cannot possibly describe God in a logical way because the sentence is not logical. I can't talk about before if there's no clock ticking. And therefore, I have to admit to myself that what I'm trying to explain is the best I can do on a human level, but I really can't get to the pintala. I really can't get to the real essence of what I'm talking about, because what I'm talking about is something I don't know what I'm talking about, and that's called God. But everything Rav Friedlander said was bepoel hoyloi kol ha'ta'orim shel hanagosin ha'nevroim v'rak lanu niskalu al yidei habriyah. Through creation, all these things are revealed. If there's no creation, if there's no one around, and there's nothing here, there's no place to reveal it to. So with the creation, all these things are now revealed. Rachum, Chanon, oh, these things are new. They're not new. They can't be new. Otherwise, it would be God was like this before, and with the creation of the world, he changed a little. All of a sudden, he's Rachum. Before, he wasn't. None of this makes sense. It's all ridiculous. All of this was in a state of Bapoel, in potential, and at the time, quote unquote, which means I don't know what I'm talking about, but at the time God decided that he wanted to create the world was created, and these things were revealed, which were in existence even before. And when we say God created, we're saying that God created them in a sense that he now revealed them to creation. And Rav Friedlander quotes now, Lochein Adon Olam Asher Molach B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra. What do those words mean? We started singing these words in elementary school. Adon Olam, master of the universe, Asher Molach, who was the king, B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra. Before anything was created, he was already king. And this is the idea of that sentence. Before anything was created, he was already the master of the universe and the master of everything. But there's no universe here, so what's he the master over? Because in potential, everything was there. There was no change. He's already the master over it, even though it hasn't been revealed. The potential hasn't become reality. He's already the king. Adon Olam Asher Malach B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra. Ki Malchusei Eina Tluya B'Gormim Shechutz Mimenu. Because God's sovereignty is not dependent on things that are external to him. Dahainu Ba'olam She Moilech Allah, the world that he rules over. We're going to take a pause here for a minute, and we're going to talk about a concept that comes up in many Sfarim on Rosh Hashanah, including the Baal HaTanya in some of his writings about Rosh Hashanah. Not in the Sefer Tanya, but the Tanya's writings on Rosh Hashanah. There's a saying, wherever the saying comes from, there's a saying that's been accepted, Ein Melech Below Am. There is no such thing as a king who doesn't have any subjects. He has no nation. He's a king, and he's wearing a crown, and he made himself a big chair, and he made himself a big house, and there's not a single piece of, maybe he's the king of his palace, he's the boss in his house, but there's not a single inch of territory over which he's sovereign. There's not a single human being that has to take orders from him. He has no power over anyone or over anything except maybe his little house or his palace. He's not a melech, not a king. He has no dominion over anything. So we have a saying, Ein melech below. There is no king without a nation, without subjects. If that's the case, so one would say that God is not a king either, because before he created the world, what is he the king over? There's no human being, there's no animals, there's nothing. There's nothing to be king over. A melech below. So is God a king before? Again, before means I don't know what I'm talking about. But is God king before creation? What is he king over? We say Adon Olam, the master of the universe. Hashem Allah, who was the king, he was the sovereign, B'terem kol yitzinim. Before anything was created, he is already the sovereign. But what is he the sovereign over? Okay, later this week we'll talk about that. But that's the concept that Rav Friedlander is alluding to in Adon Olam. Don't get God confused with a human being. Human beings have characteristic traits, God has none. A human being to be king needs subjects. God doesn't need subjects in order to be king. He's Adon Olam Hashem Allah B'terem kol yitzei nivra, because ki malchusai in the footnote, eina tluya b'gom shechutz mimeno. He doesn't need to be king based upon things that are external to him. Territory, external to him. Subjects, human subjects, external to him. He doesn't need any of that to be king. Because at all times, quote unquote times, means I don't know what I'm talking about, except this is the only way to explain it in human terms. Because always, at all time, it was kitamid, Rav Friedlander says. At all times, it was within God's power and ability to create the whole world and to create the whole kingdom. And he would rule over the kingdom. And therefore sovereignty and the kingdom are completely dependent on him. There's a human king, lahavdil. A human king, he's made himself fancy robes, made himself a fancy chair, and he's living in a fancy house. And he declares that he's king. Right now he's king over nothing. He's king over zero. To the extent that he becomes a king in the future, it'll be because in the future he will get an army together, and in the future that army will conquer territory, and in the future that army will conquer people, and these people will be subjugated, and the territory will be subjugated to this person, and now the person can actually be called king. But he starts off with the robes and the chair in his house. He's in a dream world. I'm king. He's got to do a lot of things in order that at some point he can actually be king. And this is not dependent on him. It depends upon whether he can get an army together, whether the army can conquer territory, whether people in the territory are willing to be subjugated by him, or will they revolt against him. It's not. There's so many factors dependent upon this man dreaming in a chair that I'm king. Whether he'll actually end up being king is not dependent on him. It's dependent on a whole bunch of factors that are external to him. Adon Olam Hashem Malach B'terem Kol Yitzei Nivra, the sovereign God who was sovereign before anything was created. Rav Friedlander explains it's because God decided when creation would take place, and when he would reveal all his tools and how he's going to run the world to creation. And at that moment, based upon his decision, he became king. And that was it. There's no external factors that God's dependent on. The moment he decided he wanted to be king, that was his ratzon, a world came into being. The water, everything came into being. He controlled the whole universe. Everything was people can revolt against him, not going to be very successful. God is the sovereign. It was his decision when to declare the sovereignty, and the moment he declared the sovereignty, it was Adon Olam Hashem Alach B'terem Kol Yitzei Nivra. As soon as he declared the sovereignty, boom, the world came, Adam and Chava, they went against God, they ended up in not such great shape because he is the sovereign. The man in the chair says, I'm king. Okay, everybody ignores him. Who cares what he says? The man needs to go to insane asylum. Unless he mamish gets an army together, the army does certain things, maybe one day he'll be king. That's a human king. The Ribono Shel Olam is king, B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra, because it was up to him when he's going to say, I'm king. And once he says, I'm king, he's king, finished. Let's go back to Ramchal. The last two words on page Ayin, Avo Ela Hamidas Tamid Einam Ela Mashashayach Librioisa Vloy Mashashayach Lefiatzmai. Everything that we're talking about, God said, I'm creating the world, that's my Ratzon. I'm revealing my tools by which I'm going to rule the world. And these are the tools that are used to rule the world he created, but they are not Atzmai. They are not his essence. He created tools. Lahavdal elef alfei avdolas. A king's given all kinds of tools to rule. They give him a whip. They give him a big bag of gold so that people that come in front of him, he can give them rewards of gold. They give him a whip so he can whip a person if he has to whip him. The king's given all kinds of tools so that he can run his kingdom. The king is not gold, and the king is not a whip. The king has a whip, it's a tool. The king has a bag of gold that he can distribute. The king isn't gold, he has this gold to distribute, and it's a tool he can use to reward people. We don't call the king the whip, and we don't call the king the gold. The king is the king. Allah has kama v'kama. The Rabbanu Shalom is not gold because he gave someone gold. He's not money because he gave someone money. He's not a whip because Chas v'Shalom he patched someone. The Rabbanu Shalom is the Rabbanu Shalom, and his kalim to run the world are his kalim. Because we become the beneficiaries of some of these things, we then give him names, kinuyim, the Ramchal calls them. For Omar, and the Zohar continues and says, page 71, Ayin Aleph, Kigavna do bor nishmasa. For this reason, this is what the Ramchal wants to get to. We're describing God. We're describing God so that we understand we can't describe him. That's what we learned so far. Keep on talking about God until you realize you talk enough that you really don't know what you're talking about. It's a gewaltige thing. Talk enough about God until you realize you mamish don't know what you're talking about, which I think we've done successfully this morning. But now that we've done that, the Zohar HaKadosh continues and says, Kegavna da. And for this reason, in the same vein, Bar Nishmasa, God created a neshama. So we now have the analogy directly from Rav Shimon Bar Yochai in the Raya Mehemna, that if you understand that you don't understand God, you will now understand not to understand the neshama and how the neshama works. V'hu hayois metzias haneshama, mara al shleimusa yisbara shaboy nivros. And this will help you understand the neshama, the existence of neshama, that will demonstrate to you the level of perfection of the neshama with which it was created. And it will teach you about God's shleimus. We're dealing with analogy here. Al shleimusa yisbara shaboy nivros. The neshama was created with a certain level of perfection that's a godly type of perfection. Try to talk about God and explain him. The more you'll talk about it, the more you'll understand you don't know what you're talking about because it's such a perfect unity you can't talk about it. And there's no change in it. There's no shinui. It's always there. It always was. It always is. And now think about the neshama. Oif hacha mora alma. The same thing the Zohar HaKadosh says is by God. Elakol shmon loy kegavna desviron. Uma ribbon olman lesle shem yediyah. The Zohar HaKadosh says the same way that God doesn't have a real known name, of hachi lesle nishmasa. The same thing is true by neshama. It doesn't have a real name. Now, in between here, I skipped a couple of words where the Zohar HaKadosh says kegavna desviron. It talks about, makes a mention of the spheros. We're not going to go into that. Rav Friedlander gives a little explanation in footnote 170. The point here is that the Rav Shimon Bar Yochai said, I want you to take a look at God's shleimus and understand that you don't understand anything because it's such a perfect shleimus. And since the neshama was created from ha'oras panim of the Rabbanu Shalom, I want you to understand that you really don't understand the neshama, except the neshama is some kind of perfect shleimus that makes the guf function. V'tzorach she'tiyeh medakdekes heitev al hadover hazeh. Ramchal says, you need to analyze this, be medakdek in this concept very deeply. K'dei lahavim metzias haguf v'neshama al burya v'chol hatoli boy. If you want to really understand the nature and the existence of the physical body versus the nature and the existence of the neshama and all the things that depend on guf and neshama, this is what you have to listen to and understand from the Zohar HaKadosh, because this Zohar HaKadosh makes the direct analogy between the Shleimus HaNeshama and the greater and much impossible to understand Shleimus HaBaruch. Hine ha'adon ha'yachad yisparach shemoy lefi shleimusay efshel lachanis loishum shem v'kinui. The Rabbeinu Shalom, based upon his absolute perfection, it is impossible. Efshar, it is impossible. Lachanis loishum shem v'kinui. It is impossible. You understand nothing about God's perfect perfection. You understand it is impossible to give him any name that would be attempt at describing him. We cannot, and it is impossible for us to understand such an utter perfection. And you can't nickname and describe something that you don't understand. You can't name something and say, this is what we're going to call this. Of course, a person can look at a table and say, we'll call it a shmata. But it doesn't say anything about the table. You're not describing the table. You cannot describe the Rebbeinu Shalom. You can call him whatever you want, but it's not a descriptive title. Ki Hashem hu geder bal Hashem. When you give something a name, a description, you are trying to give a geder. You're trying to give a geder is like a fence. You're giving borders to this. If I say this is a car, then I'm saying it's got 4 wheels. It's not a motorcycle with 2 wheels. If I say it's a motorcycle, it's got 2 wheels. It's not a car that has 4 wheels. As soon as I give something a descriptive title, I'm saying this is what it is, to the exclusion of everything else. And when I try to give God a name, I say, well, God is compassion. Well, compassion, what about, does he also have the Midas Hadin? Sure, he has the Midas Hadin. What else does he have? And you'll continue talking until you red or blue in the face, and you still will not know what you're talking about because you can't describe God fully. However, we as human beings, we're on the receiving end of this. We are on the receiving end of Rachamim. We're on the receiving end of Chanun. We're on the receiving end of all kinds of things. And based upon being at the receiving end of things, we say, oh, God is a this. Kegoin. We, as the receiving end, feel that there are different midos, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Kegoin Rachmanus, Memshala, God is the ruler. HaKoach, God is powerful. HaMishpat, God judges. HaChemla, also compassion. HaKaas, sometimes we say, and we talked about this many times, we say sometimes God is angry. And it says, Netoy vayicharaf Hashem, HaToykef, mightiness, Uchayoytze bazeh, all these words, Kol amid shonu masigim boy, all these midos, quote unquote, traits that we sense, mitzad puloisavim. It's because God has acted in a certain way. We're on the receiving end of that act. And now we define that act for ourselves and say, God, who I don't understand, sent me down some Rahmanis, and now I'm going to call God Rachamam because I'm the recipient of Rachamam. But I'm not describing God as having a character trait of Rahman because I have already told myself I don't understand God at all. I can't describe him at all. But being as a human being, the recipient end of Rachamim, I now am going to say, Rabbeinu Shalom Baal HaRachamim. Mitzad pu'ulois of him. It's only because we're the recipients of certain actions of God that then we give God a certain name. Oisam hamida shanaviyim asigim boy min hakoidem el hama'ucha. These are the midos, the quote-unquote traits that the Nevi'im are allowed to understand from beginning, from the start, or from the earlier point to the later point. We'll talk about this tomorrow. There's a concept about Nevuah, about how Nevi'im see things. Nevi'im see things now that are going to happen in the future. We only understand today we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But when something happens finally, we look back and get a better understanding of our past. So a Navi is in a position where in the present, he's looking at the future. Once we live that future, we look back and we understand what we went through in the past. We have a new understanding of what's happened to us in the past. So Nevi'im go from the present and see the future. We who live the words of Nevi'im, we live once that future happened, and we look back and say, oh, we now understand why all these things happened since the prophet said what he said. So there's two different views, and this is the question of how we get to see. Remember, we're talking about God's pu'uloso. We have no nickname, we have no way to describe God. And he has no intrinsic characteristic traits. What we give him a name is the fact that we are on the receiving end of a certain act of God. We say, oh, Rabbeinu Shalom, thank you for the Rahmanis, you're a big Baal Rachamim. Or Rabbeinu Shalom, please have Rahmanis on me, I'm suffering so much, please Rabbeinu Shalom, stop the din. And we say that the Rabbeinu Shalom is, he has din, he has this. These are tools that he uses, and because we're on the receiving end, so we call him something. But we need to remember that when we say these words, we're not describing him. And the Nevi'im are looking at the Ribono Shel Olam, and no, that's a bad word, they're not looking at the Rosh Hashanah. They get an understanding from the Ribono Shel Olam about what the Ribono Shel Olam is going to do. In other words, the receiving end. They get to see the receiving end before the receiving actually comes into play, before God uses the tools by which some person or some community or the world's going to be on the receiving end. The Navi prophesizes in a week, in a month, or whatever, you're going to be on the receiving end of XYZ. So the prophet is now talking about God's doing something, that someone's going to be on the receiving end in the future. So he's looking at God's quote-unquote actions from present as they will occur in the future. Other people, non-Nevi'im, are looking at what happened to them, and then they look back and say, oh, you know what? Now I understand God's Arachamim. They're looking from the event, looking into the past. Just an inyan that the Ramchal talks about. He talks about Nevuah in different places in the Sefer. We'll spend maybe a little time tomorrow. The summation of this is about Nevuah. For this particular idea is footnote 171 in Rav Friedlander's print on page Ayin Aleph 71.